CBS was the only network I didn't pitch Dirty Jobs to. I pitched it to every network and every cabler. The reason I didn't pitch it to CBS is that Dirty Jobs started as a segment on Evening Magazine called Somebody's Gotta Do It.
And I think we just feel sorry for people like Chuck, and so we keep them around as a as a way of making us feel better about ourselves. I was the first New Zealander to walk around on the dark side of the moon. Oh yeah, it's really interesting. Hand me another pub, will you? You're getting a bit of ahead of yourself there, Chuck. What do you think, you're better than us because you went to the moon, the dark side? It just irked the crap out of me that people would make derogatory comments about working class people because they were talking about my grandparents. We have all these highly skilled people who would have a real renewed purpose in life if they were encouraged to teach and share, and yet we write so many of them off. I'm in New Zealand.
What time
I'm in New
is it
Zealand
right
right now. It's like 11:30 in the morning.
What day is it? Is the better question.
So it's Wednesday, the 8th.
Oh man.
And so we're 19 hours. Is it 19? 21 hours ahead of you. But the way you work it out is you just minus 3 hours and make it the day before. That's the easiest calculation.
I feel like you're lording it over us a little bit. You know, we're 21 hours ahead of you. We know things nearly a full day before you know anything at all. And it's, it's just the burden we bear down here in Kiwi country.
Well, we live in the future, Mike, and we are literally ahead of you. And if there's anything you need to know about what it's like today, tomorrow, then just let me know because I'm living in today.
Sure, I've got a question. Am I fired tomorrow?
So yes, I was going to fire you after this show was completed, but if you want me to fire you early, it's really Mike's call. Why don't you tell everybody what you did wrong, Chuck?
Yeah,
I forgot to send.
Yeah, tell us, Chuck.
Forgot to send Mike the link to this recording. So
yes,
I'm like, hey, we're ready for you, and Mike's like,
Phil. This is the thing. Forgetting to send a link is not a fireable offense, but sending me a email with a supercilious undertone that suggests that my tardiness is somehow the proximate cause of my own deficiencies, when in fact my fake producer couldn't even be bothered. It's that little twist of the knife that, there's got to be some sort of consequence. But of course, you must have key people in your organization who, while you'd like to fire them, just the fallout of doing so is just really, all you're doing is hurting yourself long term.
Ultimately, yeah. And I think we just feel sorry for people like Chuck, and so we keep them around as a way of making us feel better about ourselves, because we realize that we're not at that. Chuck, I'm sorry, I can't continue with this. I'm
sitting.
You
right
look like
here.
a hurt little 5-year-old boy right now.
I feel a tear coming on.
It's troubling, Phil. You and I have never met face to face. We spoke briefly a couple years ago when you were getting tough as nails off the ground. And I was struck then by, at a glance anyway, the commonality of our resumes. They're not many people who I would think, oh, you know what? I think maybe they lapped me there. Your passport's thicker than mine. In other words,
and your hands might be dirtier than mine. But we do have a lot in common, and I do want to say to you that what you have done to create awareness for hardworking men and women in America is exemplary and something that was really much needed, and really why I gravitated to wanted to speak to you, because of knowing the history of your grandfather and both our grandparents. Hardworking people with real life skills, and I think what you've done to create awareness for young boys and girls thinking of working in the trades, working with and gathering life skills and getting back to that, I think it's just so hugely important, and it's a universal theme, because we have it here in New Zealand as well, where people are sort of told. I mean, it happened to me. I was told that really I wasn't going to have the opportunity for a good future unless I went to university and got a degree. It was never. I was never encouraged to think about a trade or to use life skills like my grandfather, and so. It's really, I think we're at a really pivotal time right now, and so I think what you're doing is just more important than it's ever been, quite frankly.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I was just agonizing over where to start, but I think maybe that's where we jump off with Jack, your granddad. I just read an editorial that you wrote that summed up, I thought, really beautifully everything you just said. But look, in all things, there's an anecdotal approach and there's a true hands-on experiential approach. So if you would, and I hate to ask you to tell stories you've told before, but put your pop in a nutshell for me and talk a little bit about apprenticeships, because if I'm remembering right, you came in hot. You right out of high school, right into some kind of media-based apprenticeship, circled back, as I did, to get some certifications and ultimately a degree. But the impact of really being able to surround yourself with people in your chosen trade and just absorb that information. I could go on. It's a soapbox, but that's what's missing in our country, and apparently it's missing down there too. So, congratulations for finding a loophole.
Well, yeah, no, you're so right, and I think it also speaks, Mike, to terrible ageism that we have in the country, where we have all these highly skilled people who would have a real renewed purpose in life if they were encouraged to teach and share, and yet we write so many of them off. And you walk past a lot of these highly skilled people every day, and they're in our neighborhoods, and you wouldn't even know that they've had these incredible lives because we don't pay them their respect. I grew up, with that whole adage of respect your elders and all of that. But all my grandparents never had a shot at a university education. My grandfather was the brightest kid in his middle school. He got a scholarship to a Catholic school when he was 13 to go to high school. His father, who was a coal miner, didn't. I don't know really whether my grandfather was scared to go to school or whether his father didn't want him to go to school and wanted him to go straight to work. But he basically stopped his formal education at 13. Mm-hmm. My grandmother was from a very large family. I think there were 16 kids. So she was, as a young woman, they weren't encouraged to go to university.
Still, it's so funny. I think there was 16 kids. Once you get past 10, you're like in a rounding situation.
When you run out of fingers, what can you do?
Well, apparently my great-grandfather used to rally all the kids to get into the bath, and they would share the same bath water, and the oldest kid got in the bath first, and then the other kids got in. And apparently a few neighborhood kids would accidentally find their way into the bath because he couldn't figure out who was who. But my other grandfather, he was a carpenter. His wife, my mother's mother, worked in a factory. And so my grandfather, the one that I had the most time with, he went and worked in his brother's bike shop at 13. By the time he was 19, he was an A-grade mechanic. He was a very good rifle shot, so he did a lot of shooting. He got into doing gunsmithing. He became an aero mechanic in World War II. Mm-hmm. My other grandfather repaired the planes, the wood on the planes, because there were still a lot of wood planes. Wood on planes. And anyway, he was probably one of the brightest people that I've ever met, but all self-taught. He just loved reading. And when I would spend time with him, I would just constantly learn about how to problem solve and how nothing went to waste. He had 3 sheds in the backyard. If the washing machine broke down, he'd break it down into parts and put the pump away in one and the handle, because that would be useful for something down the line. And so he had lathes in the garage and this gunsmith workshop. He ended up shooting for New Zealand, the New Zealand shooting team, target shooting team. He was the serviceman's champion for shooting rifles. So I grew up in the workshop with him a lot, doing loading, reloading, and I ended up shooting for the New Zealand under-25 team when I was 17 because of his coaching. So grew up with a respect for firearms, and a huge influence on work ethic and doing a job and doing it properly, and watching him with his hands, and I just remember so distinctly his hands manipulating things and how he would use tools, and his number one tools, his hands. And I didn't, at the time, I don't think I realized just how lucky I was to be able to be seeing that. But after spending so much time with him, and both my parents have the equivalent of doctorates in their chosen field, it just irked the crap out of me that people would make derogatory comments about working class people because they were talking about my grandparents. And so part of the motivation for me with Tough as Nails was honoring people like my grandparents and honoring the people that do the really tough yards and the ones that go out in the storms when we all huddle away in our homes and try to stay safe and warm, and the ones that are wiping down shelves in the middle of the night, and the ones that are underwater welding and doing the hard yards, the farmers that get up year after year and do the hard work. And so, again, it goes back to...
I'm sorry, Phil, but let me just jump in and congratulate you for that. I mean, or at least just return the compliment quickly, because I know how hard a sell that was in 2001 with Dirty Jobs, right? I mean, there really hadn't been anything on TV, never mind honoring, just acknowledging Jack Keoghan as you've described him. Carl Noble, my grandfather, these are the same men who lived basically the same life. So I am curious to know what kind of roadblocks you encountered on the network level. Because obviously, as you know, the cable world is one thing, broadcast is something else. And you made a name for yourself there at CBS. Was Hard as Nails a tough sell?
It was. I mean,
Tough as Nails a hard sell?
Yes, it was. And nails are tough. Well, I mean, Dirty Jobs was a groundbreaking show in that sense that suddenly we were seeing jobs that had never seen the light of day, literally. Like, you were going into places and showing off job sites and people's lives that nobody had seen. Nobody actually wanted to talk about or acknowledge. When you have a toilet that's blocked and it's flooding your house, there's somebody you have to call to fix that, and somebody who knows how to fix that. Or you've got a leak in your wall and there's gray water in your wall, and somebody's got to come in and do that. Or you've got to put a roof on and you don't want it to leak and you want it to last years. I mean, I remember my grandfather, Jack, showing off about my other grandfather who put in windows. He was a joiner and put in these windows that were 40 years old and still slid up perfectly. And my grandfather, my father's father, was so proud that he had the windows that my other grandfather had put in and said, "Look at the workmanship. This is 40 years. And look, they slide up and down perfectly." So yes, it was an incredibly hard sell. And I first pitched Tough as Nails in its original form to CBS in 2008. I was sort of told that at that time I was told to, a show like that about real people. My wife came up with this, my wife and producing partner came up with the line, real people in real life who are real tough. And I think that sort of really explains the ethos of what Tough as Nails is. And I was told, no, a show like that's, nobody's going to want to watch that. I went back and I pitched it in 2010. And the head of scheduling then was a guy, Kelly Call, who ended up becoming the president of CBS, who loved the idea. And so did David Staff, who was who runs CBS television studios. They gave me some development money to develop it. I put together a presentation. I pitched it to CBS. It got turned down again. In 2013, I was given a little bit more money because they'd had quite a few shows that hadn't worked. I went back and I did another presentation in 2013. I then kept going, pushing. All of a sudden, the years are ticking by, and now it's 2017. I got some more money, and this time I cast it, and I put together a proper sizzle. So that's 2017. So that's 9 years later, and then.
And Phil, meanwhile, you're crushing it with The Amazing Race, right? You're a proven entity. You're at CBS. I mean, it couldn't have been easy for them to tell you no at that point at the same time, although they're very good at it. And I just mentioned this for your own edification. CBS was the only network I didn't pitch Dirty Jobs to. I pitched it to every network and every cabler. The reason I didn't pitch it to CBS is that Dirty Jobs started as a segment on Evening Magazine called Somebody's Got to Do It, which they fired me for. Okay. Nobody wanted to see me crawling through a sewer. And so CBS said, get out, and I took the demo tape with me. And so that's why sitting here talking to you today, it's just so full circle for me to see a legitimate host get that ethos on a broadcast network. And you guys are in what, season 5 now or 6?
We shot 5. We're preparing for 6. We shot 5 seasons, 50 hours in 2.5 years. I think in 2021 I had 1 day off. So it's a 7-day-a-week thing. And if you look at our budget is about 60% of the bigger budgets on the bigger reality shows. We shoot and deliver in 4K, which I'm very proud of. I went back to old photographs of Rosie the Riveter, and I went to the Library of Congress. They've got this great book with working class people of America in the late 40s, early 50s. And there's the Ektachrome film has this really cool look to it where it's the deep inky blacks and then the rich primary colors. It's got a very distinctive
Saturated.
look. Yes. Yeah. Highly saturated in these inky blacks. I just love when the blacks drop right off and then you get the highlights and then the rich yellows and reds and blues. So I created this style look, this look for the show, and I wanted hands and faces and sweat and drips, and I wanted it to look gritty. And I said, I don't want you to glam this up. I don't want you to make it look like a dating show where they deliberately diffuse the faces and soften the light and make it all very front-lit. I said, we're going to shoot into the sun. It's going to look gritty and dirty. I said, there's going to be backlit water, backlit dust. I don't care what these people look like, because when they're on the job site, trust me, they're not looking pretty. They're not turning up to a beauty show. I said, I want that to come across. And so I then went to a wildlife photographer who'd never shot reality, who shoots lions and films lions in Africa and works on a long lens and sits in a bush for 5 days. And I said, I want you to come and shoot this show. I said, and the good news is you don't have to wait 5 days for an animal to jump out of a bush. I said, there's going to be people working. And I just want close-ups, extreme close-ups of eyes and hands and faces and grit. And so I managed to convince him to come on. I got a guy who's never colored any reality show in his life who does commercials and features to grade it. We spend way more time on the grade. I don't know if you've seen the show, but it has a very distinctive look to it.
Oh, yeah.
And then I handpicked people to come in on the show it was very, very important to me that every single crew member had someone in their family, and most people do, that they could say, that's my Uncle Bill, that's my Aunt Mary. We had one person who worked with Rosie the Riveter in the factory. Like that's people, amazing. And I got them to share their stories because I wanted all of them to dive back to that and get into that mindset and go, there's enough shows honoring celebrities and wannabe celebrities. We're not going to do that. We're going to put a spotlight on the people you don't see at 3 o'clock in the morning working. Those are the people we're going to highlight. And so that's what made it a hard sell, because celebrity sells and hardworking people who work at 3 o'clock in the morning don't necessarily sell off the shelf, so to speak.
And it's hard, dude. It's very, very hard to go toe-to-toe with an executive and an executive committee and sometimes a production company, although I realize this is your own thing. it is people don't really quite understand what it takes to take the reverse commute when it comes to creating content. So, but you've done it a couple times. The Amazing Race didn't look like anything else I had seen when that thing came along. And when I look back at your resume, you know, from the bucket list to the No Opportunity Wasted, the books that you've written. In fact, I wrote this down. Maybe we can riff on this for a second. That's fairly interesting. Have you that show? I mean, look, we could do 2 hours on this, Chuck. This is the title of a show in New Zealand called that.
That's fairly.
Was it That's Fairly or That Was Fairly?
Well, you just basically summed up the New Zealand culture in a few words. So back in the late 80s, I hosted that show in 1989. And I was with 3 other hosts. And in New Zealand, we have a culture, it still exists today, where nobody is allowed to show off. And if you do, you'll quickly get chopped down. It's called the tall poppy syndrome.
Tall poppy, right, of course.
Do you know this saying, Mike? Tall poppy?
Well, I know how beautiful a field of poppies looks when everything is uniform.
Yes.
And how everybody, right? I mean, if I remember it right, the syndrome occurs when one poppy grows a little taller than the rest.
That's
and
absolutely
it doesn't go over. It doesn't go over well in New Zealand.
No, if one little poppy comes rising up out of that field, then New Zealand society likes to come along and clip it off because we love to have everybody the same. And I remember when I first started as a television assistant. I was 18 years old, straight out of high school, against my parents' wishes because everybody else I was at school with was gone to university, and I was doing an apprenticeship. And some of my first jobs were running up and down the sidelines at rugby matches, dragging the cable behind the cameraman and sweeping floors and making coffee. And I remember we did an interview with the All Black rugby team, and if I'm not mistaken, it was 1986, and I think we beat Scotland 86-0 or some crazy score. It was a world record, and they were interviewing the New Zealand rugby player, and they said, you know, how does it feel? It's a world record. It's 86-0. How does it feel? And he goes, look, the ball was wet, and you really got to hand it to the other team. They came out here today, and they really gave it everything. And the boys played pretty well. But you know, look, Scotland, you know, they didn't just hand it to us. and that in a nutshell is New Zealand. So while in America in the 80s, it was that's incredible. You know, like they would remember that show, That's Incredible? It was,
of course.
Yeah. This was our version of That's Incredible. So nobody in New Zealand dared to say, oh my God, that's incredible. So in New Zealand, it would be like you'd be at a pub, you'd be having a drink, and we'd be sitting there with, you know, Chuck, and we'd be having a beer, and Chuck would say, as a Kiwi, he'd say, oh, yeah, no, I went to the moon yesterday. And, oh, did you? Yeah, I went to the moon. I was the first New Zealander to walk around on the dark side of the moon. Oh, yeah, it's fairly interesting. Hand me another pub, will you? I mean, that's like nobody wants to get excited because they don't want to give Chuck his, you know, like you're getting a bit of ahead of yourself there, Chuck. What do you think? You're better than us because you went to the moon, the dark side?
Tall poppy, yeah, the dark side. Yeah, good for you son of a... Well, yeah, you know, it's, I mean, again, that's what's so interesting about your evolution, because you're not, you know, the 10-time Emmy-winning host of the rather interesting race, right? It's the amazing race. Yeah. Like
that's true.
You're over here in the land of tall poppies, where everybody is weighed and measured by their own relative worth. You know, we don't clip down the tall. I mean, we kind of do, but we also build them up. Right? Yeah. Because there's nothing more fun than knocking down a tall poppy, especially if you grow it and water it yourself. So we create our celebrities. We create our heroes. Then we rip them down and pee on them, you know?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a
so
different.
what-
It's definitely a different mindset that it takes a little bit to get used to because you come to America. I remember coming to America and I remember I was working at Fox at the time. I was doing a morning show. It was a live morning show. It was my first American solid gig, and I remember one of the producers came up to me and said, "Oh my God, you're the greatest. You're really the greatest. I really love the way you do your stories. It's just so insightful." And I walked away and I was like, "Well, I'm the greatest. Like, this is amazing." So I walk off. I'm feeling really proud of myself. I went and get a cup of coffee and I come walking back, and then I overhear the same producer talking to another reporter. "You are just the greatest. Oh my God, I just love what you do." And I was like, "But I thought I was the greatest." But you don't say that, and you don't say that. Or genius is another word that's thrown around. Like, he's
my
genius. Genius.
yeah.
If you like what you heard,
And even if you don't,
Oh, won't you please,
pretty please, subscribe. Well, I hate to beg and I hate to plead, but please, pretty freaking please, please.